For 10,000 years, the rhythm of human life was dictated by two things: the sun and the seasons. Life was slow, life was predictable. Tools were simply extensions of the human arm. Power was limited to the strength of a horse, the flow of a river, or the direction of the wind. If you were a merchant in the year 1700, you lived in a world fundamentally similar to a merchant in ancient Rome. Everything was hand-produced, local, and finite. But in the late 18th century, that ancient rhythm began to shatter. In the damp, mineral-rich landscape of Great Britain, humans learned how to extract power from the earth itself, scaling it beyond anything seen before. We call it the Industrial Revolution. It was the moment humanity unlocked the stored energy of millions of years to drive the gears of a new civilization. It was a spark that lit a fire, and that fire is still burning today. To understand how we became modern, we have to go back to the origins of industry. We have to ask, why Britain and why then? In the mid-18th century, Great Britain was the leading commercial nation on Earth. It controlled a global empire stretching from the Caribbean to the Indian subcontinent. But beyond its colonies, Britain sat on a literal mountain of coal. This resource, combined with a unique entrepreneurial spirit, would forge a new world. But coal wasn't the only factor. Britain's rise was built on 5 distinct pillars. First was agricultural productivity. Using mechanical seed drills and iron plows, farmers could produce more food with fewer workers. This created a displaced labor force, people who had no choice but to look for work in the growing towns. Second was political stability. Unlike its neighbors in Europe, Britain's legal system protected property rights, encouraging investment and risk-taking. The third pillar was a geographic windfall. As an island with navigable rivers and extensive coastlines, transporting heavy goods like coal and iron was easier here than anywhere else on Earth. Fourth was the scientific revolution. A culture of experimentation had emerged, a world where people weren't afraid to tinker with the laws of physics. And finally, a unique economic incentive: high wages and cheap energy. In Britain, it was expensive to hire a man, but incredibly cheap to buy coal. This created a massive motivation to build machines that could do the work of humans. The stage was set, the fuel was ready. All it needed was a spark. Before the factories, there was the putting out system. In small villages, families worked in their own homes. Women spun raw wool into yarn. Men wove that yarn into cloth. It was a slow, domestic life. But the demand for textiles was exploding. Britain had developed a taste for white gold, cotton. However, there was a problem. Initially, Britain could not compete with the delicate hand-woven fabrics coming from India. Indian labor was 5 times cheaper, and their quality was unmatched. The British government even passed the Calico Acts to protect domestic wool from these imports. But instead of stopping the trade, these laws forced British entrepreneurs to innovate. They needed a way to make cotton faster and cheaper than the Indian artisans. The first domino fell in 1733 with John Kay's flying shuttle, doubling a weaver's output. But this created a bottleneck. There wasn't enough yarn to keep up. Then came James Hargreaves' spinning jenny, and later Richard Arkwright's water frame. Arkwright's machine was too large for a home and required the power of a rushing river. He built the world's first true cotton mills. He proved that production was no longer a family affair. It was now an industrial process. While textile mills were spinning the world's clothing, another revolution was happening underground. As coal mines grew deeper, they faced a constant enemy: water. Traditional pumps were too weak to clear the flooding shafts. This necessity led to the birth of the steam engine. Thomas Newcomen introduced the first successful piston steam engine.
It was massive, hulking, and incredibly inefficient. But since coal was cheap at the mine, the waste didn't matter. The true turning point, however, came from a Scotsman named James Watt. Watt realized a fatal flaw in the Newcomen engine. By adding a separate condenser, he increased efficiency so much that his engines used only a fraction of the coal. By the time the Watt engine was perfected, it could drive the machinery of an entire factory. For the first time in history, mankind was no longer dependent on the wind, the tide, or the muscle of an animal. A factory could be built anywhere. Steam was applied to everything. It blew bellows, it hammered iron, and it drove the looms. The invisible army of mechanical workers was growing by the thousands. Steam needed iron, and iron needed coal. It was a closed loop of industrial necessity. For centuries, iron smelting relied on charcoal, meaning the industry was limited by the growth of forests. But a breakthrough by the Darby family changed everything. They discovered that coke, a purified form of coal, could fuel blast furnaces. This allowed for massive production and much larger structures. The Iron Bridge, which still stands today, was a signal to the planet. A new material had arrived to replace stone and wood. New processes such as puddling and rolling allowed for mass production of structural iron at a fraction of the cost. But this progress had a human price. Puddling was backbreaking, dangerous work. Few workers lived to see their 40th year. Yet it was their labor that built the bridges, the factories, and eventually the railways that would knit the world together. This was the era of the Great Migration. In 1800, only 3% of the human population lived in cities. By the end of the century, that number approached 50%. Families were pushed from the countryside by the enclosure of common lands and pulled toward the towns by the promise of steady wages. Manchester became the template for this new world. Its population exploded from 10,000 to over 2 million in just 2 centuries. But this growth was chaotic. Cities weren't prepared for the influx. Families were squeezed into overcrowded slums, living in shanties with dirt floors and no sanitation. Friedrich Engels famously described these backstreets as a stony desert, where rivers turned green with chemical waste. Inside the factories, a new kind of discipline emerged. In the rural world, work followed the sun. In the factory, work followed the clock. The system demanded that humans adapt to the pace of the machines. Shifts lasted 14 hours, and the most vulnerable hit hardest. Children as young as 8 worked as scavengers, crawling under moving machinery. This profound social crisis eventually forced the government to act, leading to the first Factory Acts, the beginning of the long road toward labor rights and public education. As production soared, the world's old arteries began to clog. Muddy roads and slow river barges could no longer sustain the weight of progress. The revolution needed a logistical miracle. First came the age of canals. Projects like the Bridgewater Canal proved that moving coal by water was far more efficient, cutting coal prices in major cities by half almost overnight. But the canals were soon eclipsed by the most iconic invention of the era, the railway. Railways were the ultimate synergy of the revolution: cheap iron for the rails and high-pressure steam for the engine. When the first intercity line opened between Liverpool and Manchester, it was a sensation. Passengers could travel between cities in hours instead of days. The world was shrinking. The railway broke the isolation of the rural world and allowed ideas and goods to spread at the speed of steam. For decades, Britain tried to guard its industrial secrets like state secrets. Laws were passed to prevent the emigration of skilled workers and the export of machinery, but a fire this large cannot be contained. Belgium was the first to follow, fueled by its own coal deposits. Germany, though initially divided, used the railway as a catalyst to link its states, eventually turning the Ruhr Valley into a powerhouse of heavy industry. Across the Atlantic, the United States added its own innovation, the American system of manufacturing, interchangeable parts. This allowed for mass production on a scale never seen before. Even in the East, the revolution took root. Following the Meiji Restoration, Japan transformed itself from a feudal society into a modern industrial power in just a few decades. The machine was now a global phenomenon. Not everyone welcomed the arrival of the machine. For the skilled artisan, the factory wasn't progress, it was obsolescence. This despair fueled the Luddite movement, where workers broke into factories to smash the machines that had stolen their livelihoods. The government responded with force, but the unrest birthed something new, the trade union. Workers realized that while one man was powerless, 1,000 men could halt production. Despite early bans, unions slowly gained the right to negotiate for better wages and safer conditions. At the same time, the Romantics, poets, and artists recoiled at the dark satanic mills, mourning the loss of nature. Even the environment began to push back, as smoke pollution and waterborne diseases like cholera forced the first modern environmental regulations. By the middle of the 19th century, the first revolution had matured, but a second wave was gathering strength, one defined not by iron and steam, but steel, chemicals, and electricity. The Bessemer process made steel cheap and abundant, allowing for the birth of the skyscraper. Petroleum began to challenge coal, and the internal combustion engine opened the door to the automotive age. Electricity brought a new kind of magic. The rhythm of the city became permanent, 24 hours a day. With the electrical telegraph, communication became instantaneous. The world was now connected by a web of wires and signals. The Industrial Revolution didn't just build our cities, it fundamentally redefined what it means to be human. It shifted us from a species that followed the slow rhythm of the seasons to one that demands the world move at the speed of a machine. We have inherited a world of boundless convenience, but we also carry the weight of the environmental and social shadows that progress left behind. The legacy of that 18th century coal fire is embedded in the very DNA of our modern lives. Revolutions arrive silently. By the time we notice them, we can no longer imagine life without them. The past isn't just a memory, it's the engine that's still turning. And as the gears of the 21st century continue to grind toward automation and AI, we have to ask, where is the machine taking us next?